No, no, Pastor Kofi, don't touch me. Her voice rang out like a piercing cry, cutting through the silence of the room. She pulled away from Kofi, her body trembling as though in fear. Kofi froze. He couldn't understand what was happening. He had done nothing wrong. He had just come to pray for her. But Rose continued to scream, now visibly upset, tears streaming down her face. "You touched me. You tried to do something to me. You're a bad pastor, a terrible man," she cried, her voice full of anguish. The elders quickly sprang into action. They began filming, capturing every moment, every word. They acted as though they had no idea what was going on. Kofi's heart raced. He tried to calm Rose, to explain that he had done nothing wrong, but she wasn't listening. She was playing her part perfectly. Help me, Rose shouted, looking toward the elders. "He's been harassing me for months. I can't take it anymore." Before we'll begin this gripping true story, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like and share this video, and comment where you are watching from. Is this really happening to me? How did I get here? Pastor Kofi's heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as they were handcuffed behind his back. The cold metal bit into his skin, but it felt like nothing compared to the weight of the shame and disbelief crushing his spirit. He stood in front of his house, flanked by police officers, while a growing crowd of church members and neighbors stared at him. The whispers and judgment-filled glances were unbearable. Some muttered prayers, others shook their heads in disbelief. But all of them believed the same thing. He was guilty. The media cameras flashed. Phones were raised to capture every moment, as if it were a circus spectacle. Pastor Kofi, once the embodiment of virtue in his community, was now a criminal in the eyes of everyone he had ever known. He didn't understand it. His mind couldn't process how his life had come to this point. Yesterday, he had been leading his congregation with love, integrity, and transparency. Today, he was being carted away like a common criminal. False accusations, betrayal, lies. How did it all go so wrong? The thought was enough to make his knees feel weak, but he remained standing, trying to hold on to whatever shred of dignity he had left. A police officer approached, his expression stoic. "Pastor Kofi," the officer said in a voice that was almost mechanical, as though this were a routine matter for him, "you are under arrest for the unlawful assault and misconduct with a female member of your congregation. You have the right to remain silent." The words seemed to echo in Pastor Kofi's mind, but it was Rose's voice that kept ringing in his ears. Her screams, her accusations. "I didn't do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet full of conviction. His eyes darted toward the small crowd of church members who had gathered outside, their faces torn between confusion and judgment. It felt like they had already made up their minds about his guilt. Some looked away in shame, some covered their faces, and others stared coldly, as if they were seeing a monster for the first time. Behind the police officers, he saw Elder Patrick standing at the edge of the crowd, watching him with an air of quiet satisfaction. The elder's face was cold, almost too calm, but his eyes held something that made Kofi's blood run cold. Triumph. Pastor Kofi stared at the floor of the police van, his heart heavy with confusion. The metallic clank of the handcuffs around his wrists was deafening in the silence that had enveloped him. His mind raced, replaying every moment from the day before. He couldn't make sense of how he had gone from being the respected leader of his church to being falsely accused of something so heinous. He remembered the days when everything had been so simple. When he first walked into the pulpit of the church, full of hope and faith, with nothing but his love for God and his people to guide him. How it started. Far back in time, Pastor Kofi was born in a small village in the heart of Nigeria, far away from the lights and glitter of the city. His family didn't have much, but they had enough. His father was a farmer, and his mother was a teacher at the local school. Despite their modest lifestyle, they were rich in love, and they instilled in Kofi the values of honesty, humility, and hard work. From an early age, Kofi showed signs of a deep spiritual nature. He was always the one to pray before meals, the one who helped his parents with chores without being asked, the one who would sit for hours listening to stories of biblical heroes and their struggles. His mother, though strict, often said, "If God has chosen you, son, he will lead you through all challenges, just as he led his people out of the wilderness." Kofi's heart swelled with the idea of serving God. The thought of leading people to salvation, of guiding them through their own struggles, became his driving purpose. After finishing secondary school, Kofi moved to Lagos to pursue his dreams of becoming a pastor. It wasn't easy. Lagos was a bustling city filled with opportunities, but also fierce competition. He worked hard, doing odd jobs and volunteering at local churches while studying theology at a nearby seminary. He never gave up. Eventually, his persistence paid off. A small church in a busy part of Lagos offered him the opportunity to serve as their pastor. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover his expenses, but it was a start. It was his chance to begin the work he had always dreamed of. He worked tirelessly, visiting the sick, praying with the needy, and preaching with passion to the handful of people who showed up each Sunday. But even then, the humble pastor had always been driven by one thing: integrity. He could not stand to see corruption, and it deeply pained him when he saw members of the church misusing their positions. He never stood for it. Kofi's reputation for honesty soon spread far beyond his small church, and it wasn't long before the elders of larger congregations took notice. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when the call came. The bishop of a large and influential church in Lagos had heard of Kofi's work and wanted to meet him. Kofi was skeptical at first. Why would a bishop of such a grand church want anything to do with him, a humble pastor of a small church in the outskirts of the city? But when the bishop explained the opportunity, an offer to head a thriving church community that needed a new leader, Kofi couldn't believe his ears. The bishop's words were filled with praise. "We've been watching you, Pastor Kofi. You have the character, the spirit, and the wisdom we need. The position is yours if you want it." At first, Kofi hesitated. He loved his small congregation. He didn't want to leave them behind. But after much prayer and reflection, he realized that this was a divine opportunity. The church had grown rapidly, and it was time for a new leader, someone who could bring transparency, accountability, and the love of Christ to an even larger group of people. When he finally accepted, the whole community celebrated. Kofi moved into his new position as the head pastor of one of the largest churches in Lagos, overseeing not only the spiritual well-being of the members, but also the financial and logistical aspects of the church's operations. It was a dream come true, or so he thought. At first, everything seemed perfect. The congregation was large, the offerings were abundant, and the church's social programs flourished. Kofi was proud of what they were accomplishing. They were able to help the poor, support orphanages, and feed thousands of people every month. He poured his heart into the ministry, dedicating long hours to his sermons and outreach efforts. However, there were things happening behind the scenes that Kofi couldn't ignore. He started to notice discrepancies in the church's finances. The funds for the social programs never seemed to match the donations that were coming in. There were murmurs among the church staff about money being mismanaged, and Kofi soon found out that there were even reports of some of the elders taking church funds for their personal use. Kofi was stunned. How could this happen in a church of all places? How could the leaders of the church, the ones who were supposed to be shepherds of God's people, allow such corruption to go unchecked? He immediately set up an audit of the church's finances, hiring a team of accountants to go over every transaction, every expenditure, every budget. What they found was shocking. Over the course of several years, millions of naira had been misappropriated. The elders, some of whom had been in the church for decades, had been using the church's funds for their own personal gain, and it had been going on for years. Kofi was appalled. The first thing he did was confront the elders, one by one. One evening, Kofi called a meeting with the church elders at the main church office. He was calm, but his voice was firm. "Brothers," Kofi began, addressing the group, "we've built something beautiful here, but I cannot, in good conscience, allow this corruption to continue. I've seen the numbers. I know what's been happening. This is not just an issue of money, it's about the integrity of the church." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Kofi could feel the tension rising. He knew this would not be an easy conversation. Elder Patrick, the head of the elder committee, spoke up, his voice smooth but laden with a hint of condescension. "Pastor, we understand your concerns, but you're new here. You don't fully understand how things work. This church has always operated like this. It's part of the way we do things in order to keep the ministry running smoothly." Kofi's eyes narrowed. "I don't care about how things have always been done," he replied, his voice cold but resolute. "This is God's house, and we will not use it for personal gain. The people trust us, and it is our duty to lead them with integrity." The room grew uncomfortable. The elders exchanged glances. Elder Patrick cleared his throat. "Pastor Kofi, we all know that you've brought a fresh perspective, but you need to understand that these matters are not as simple as you make them out to be. The church is not just a place of worship, it's a business that needs funding, management, and sometimes certain compromises." The words stung Kofi's ears. The audacity, the blatant disregard for the sanctity of the church's mission. His hands clenched into fists. "No," Kofi said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm not compromising, and neither should any of you." That was the moment the rift began. After that meeting, things started to change in the church. The elders began to distance themselves from Kofi, whispering behind his back about his rigid ways. They didn't like his transparency. They didn't like that he was doing things by the book, insisting on accounting for every naira spent. Kofi didn't care. He continued his work, speaking to his congregation about faith, about honesty, about the importance of putting God first. He believed that the truth would eventually win. But the elders had other plans. As the weeks went by, Kofi could sense the shift in the church. There were fewer smiles in the hallways, fewer handshakes from the elders. The atmosphere grew colder. Kofi began to feel the weight of the position he had once dreamed of. He wasn't just battling against corruption. He was fighting a system that had been entrenched for years. He couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, but the only people who seemed to care were the church members, the ones who looked to him for guidance. But even they were starting to doubt him, unsure of what to believe. The whispers from the elders were starting to take root. "This is war, and I'm not backing down." Pastor Kofi sat alone in his study, his hands folded in prayer. The tension that had been mounting in the church over the past few weeks now seemed to be boiling over. His heart was heavy, and the weight of the responsibility he bore felt more unbearable with each passing day. But his resolve remained unbroken. He had no intention of compromising his values, not even for the elders who had become increasingly hostile toward him. The flashing images of that afternoon's confrontation with Elder Patrick played in his mind over and over again. The elder's smug face, his cold words, everything about that moment felt like a warning. The battle lines had been drawn, and Kofi knew that things would never be the same again. He had come to Lagos with a dream, to lead a congregation that thrived spiritually, a place where people would feel God's love, where faith would be about serving others, not about personal gain. But now his dream was slipping through his fingers, overshadowed by a bitter, power-hungry group of elders who seemed willing to sacrifice everything for their own benefit. As his eyes stared out the window, watching the bustling Lagos streets below, Kofi felt the weight of what was to come. There were whispers now, murmurs of doubt from members of the congregation. The more he dug into the church's finances, the more discrepancies he found, more embezzlement, more mismanagement. The elders knew that they couldn't let Kofi continue with his reforms. His stubbornness was threatening their entire operation. What bothered them most was his refusal to share the church's wealth that had, for years, been divided among the elders and used to fund their lavish lifestyles. They had grown accustomed to the perks that came with their positions: expensive cars, weekend getaways, and the freedom to pocket whatever they could get away with. But Kofi's rigid leadership threatened to end all that. It was Elder Patrick, the chairman of the church's elder committee, who had devised the plan to get rid of Kofi. He was the one who had quietly gathered the rest of the elders to discuss their next steps. The church was powerful. It had wealth, influence, and a loyal congregation. But now they had to ensure that Kofi would be removed from his position. The elders needed to act quickly before Kofi's growing support among the congregation could rally enough people to make a difference. They needed to undermine him, destroy his reputation, and discredit everything he had built. The perfect pawn had already been found in Rose, the church's choir mistress. Rose was well known in the church, adored by the congregation for her beautiful voice and commitment to the ministry. But beneath her angelic exterior, Rose had a troubled past. She had made mistakes, mistakes that the elders knew about, and more importantly, mistakes that could be used to manipulate her. Elder Patrick had made his move. He'd approached Rose with an offer she couldn't refuse. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Rose received the call. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. It was Elder Patrick. She hesitated for a moment before answering, already knowing what was coming. "Rose," Elder Patrick's voice came through the phone, smooth and commanding. "I need to speak with you about something important, something that could change everything." Rose had always respected Elder Patrick. He was powerful, influential, and the leader of the Elder Committee. But there was something in his tone today that felt different, urgent even. "What is it, Elder Patrick?" Rose asked, trying to mask the unease she was feeling. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "It's an opportunity for you to finally solve all your problems. I know you're struggling, and I think I can help you." Rose furrowed her brow. "What kind of opportunity?" "There's a situation in the church," Patrick continued, "a situation that needs to be handled quickly. The new pastor, Kofi, he's not the right fit for this church. He's making things difficult for us. He's trying to change everything, and it's not working. We want him removed from his office as head pastor." Rose felt her heart race. She had heard rumors about Pastor Kofi, the whispers about his strictness, about his refusal to go along with the elders. But she never thought things would escalate this far. Patrick's voice dropped lower. "Here's what I'm proposing. You accuse Kofi of something serious. You claim that he touched you inappropriately, that he made advances toward you. I know it's a difficult thing to do, but it's the only way we can remove him from the church. The elders are behind me on this. We'll make sure you're taken care of, financially and otherwise." Rose's breath caught in her throat. This was no small thing. The consequences of such an accusation could ruin Kofi's life. It could destroy him completely. But Rose knew she had no choice. She was struggling, financially, emotionally, and spiritually. She had been living in a small, run-down apartment for months, barely able to make ends meet. The promise of 1 million naira was an offer she couldn't ignore. "I don't know, Elder Patrick." Rose hesitated, her voice shaking slightly. "This is a big thing to accuse someone of. Are you sure this is the right way?" "Trust me," Patrick replied, his voice cold and calculating. "This is the only way. You'll never have to worry about anything again. You'll be set for life." Rose closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew it was wrong, but at that moment it felt like her only option. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The next day, everything was in place. Rose had called Pastor Kofi, pretending to be in distress. She told him she wasn't feeling well and needed his prayers. Kofi, always compassionate and willing to help, didn't hesitate. He rushed over to her apartment, eager to offer support to his troubled choir mistress. When he arrived, Rose greeted him with a forced smile, her eyes wide with fake concern. Kofi didn't notice the glint of manipulation behind her eyes. He believed her, just as he believed all of his congregation. He truly cared about them. Inside the apartment, he knelt beside Rose and began praying for her, laying his hands on her head, asking God to heal her and guide her through whatever she was going through. But as Kofi closed his eyes in prayer, Elder Patrick and several other elders quietly entered the room, their faces grim. They were holding cameras, waiting for the moment to strike. Suddenly, Rose screamed, "No, no, Pastor Kofi, don't touch me." Her voice rang out like a piercing cry, cutting through the silence of the room. She pulled away from Kofi, her body trembling as though in fear. Kofi froze. He couldn't understand what was happening. He had done nothing wrong. He had just come to pray for her. But Rose continued to scream, now visibly upset, tears streaming down her face. "You touched me. You tried to do something to me. You're a bad pastor, a terrible man," she cried, her voice full of anguish. The elders quickly sprang into action. They began filming, capturing every moment, every word. They acted as though they had no idea what was going on. Kofi's heart raced. He tried to calm Rose, to explain that he had done nothing wrong, but she wasn't listening. She was playing her part perfectly. Help me, Rose shouted, looking toward the elders. He's been harassing me for months. I can't take it anymore. The elders looked on, their faces feigned with shock and concern. They nodded in agreement, playing their role in the charade. Kofi's world was crumbling. The walls were closing in on him. He couldn't believe what was happening. Your disgrace, Pastor Kofi. A big disgrace to the church. The words rang through Pastor Kofi's mind like a death knell. He stood frozen in the living room of Rose's small apartment, his hands trembling as the scene played out before him. His thoughts were chaotic, his heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Rose's screams echoed in his ears, but his focus was on the figures standing in the shadows, the elders, who were now capturing everything on their cameras. The cameras clicked incessantly, documenting each and every moment. The flashing lights felt like stabs in his chest, each one stripping away another layer of his dignity. The image of Rose, her face tear-streaked and frantic, burned itself into his mind. The words she had shouted, accusing him of touching her, of hurting her, felt like a slap to his soul. He could barely comprehend the situation. He had done nothing but offer a prayer. But Rose was playing her part so convincingly, her hysteria feeding the narrative the elders were eager to sell. One of the elders, Elder Solomon, stood at the doorway, observing everything with a practiced indifference. The others, Elder Patrick, Elder Thomas, and Elder Eunice, watched the unfolding drama, their expressions unreadable. But Kofi could feel the cold weight of their gazes, all directed at him. He was the target. He could see it now. The trap had been set. Kofi's body was on autopilot as he tried to console Rose, but every word he spoke seemed to make things worse. Rose, please calm down. I didn't do anything to you. You're my sister in Christ. I only came here to pray for you. His words were a weak defense against the storm that had erupted in the room. No, Rose sobbed, her hands trembling as she pulled away from him. You touched me. You harassed me. Everyone needs to know the truth. She fell to the ground dramatically, clutching her chest as if in pain, her sobs growing louder. The elders, still standing back and recording, nodded as though confirming the scene they were witnessing. The camera flashes and the stifling silence in the room made Kofi feel like he was suffocating. He couldn't think clearly. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was a setup, but the overwhelming reality of the situation, the evidence, the cameras, the public outcry, was too much. Elder Patrick stepped forward, a smug smile on his face. Pastor Kofi, he said, his voice calm, measured. It's clear what happened here. We've seen it with our own eyes. You've touched this young woman inappropriately, and I'm afraid your actions will have consequences. The church cannot stand behind a man like you. The words pierced through Kofi like a sharp blade. The church cannot stand behind a man like you. His heart sank. The weight of betrayal, the weight of being accused, of being abandoned by the very institution he had worked so hard to build, was unbearable. The rumors spread. The next few hours were a blur. Rose had called the police, and they arrived quickly, with their usual air of detachment. Kofi tried to explain, but his words were lost in the whirlwind of accusations that surrounded him. By the time the authorities left with him in handcuffs, the damage had already been done. The rumors had spread like wildfire. The news outlets were quick to pick up the story, and before Kofi could even process what had happened, his face was plastered across the front pages of newspapers and the lead story on news websites. Pastor Kofi arrested for inappropriate misconduct with choir mistress. That headline echoed in his mind, burning into his consciousness. The man who had dedicated his life to serving God and his community was now being painted as a criminal, a predator, a man who had abused his position of power to exploit a vulnerable young woman. At that moment, Kofi could barely recognize the world around him. The city he had once felt called to serve had turned on him. His phone rang incessantly, but he didn't want to answer. The voices on the other end of the line were all the same, asking for clarification, questioning his character, doubting his innocence. Back at the church, Elder Patrick and the rest of the elder committee met in secret. The church building was quiet, the air thick with tension as they discussed their next steps. We've done it, Patrick said, his voice almost gleeful. Pastor Kofi is finished. This is the end of his reign. Elder Solomon, the eldest member of the committee, nodded gravely. This was the only way. He was becoming a problem, taking control of the finances, demanding transparency. He was trying to change everything. We couldn't let him continue. Elder Thomas chimed in, his voice low. What about the congregation? They're going to ask questions. They'll want to know why we didn't protect him, why we didn't step in sooner. Patrick waved him off dismissively. The people will believe whatever we tell them. The media is already on our side, and they'll be spreading the news about his arrest. The truth is irrelevant. All that matters is that we control the narrative. Elder Eunice, the only woman in the group, sat silently for a moment, her arms crossed over her chest. And Rose? What's her part in all of this? She did a good job playing the victim, but what if she starts to have second thoughts? What if she gets scared? Patrick smiled darkly. Rose is a means to an end. She has no choice now. If she tries to back out, we'll make sure she regrets it. We have enough on her to ensure she stays silent. She'll never speak out. The money is already in her hands, and that's all she needs. There was a pause as the elders absorbed this. They had done it. They had used Rose, manipulated her, and in doing so, they had secured their control over the church once again. Kofi was no longer a threat. The church, once filled with joy and community, now felt empty. The pews that had been filled with worshippers every Sunday morning were now filled with empty spaces. The air was thick with whispers as people gathered in small circles, discussing the scandal that had rocked their once beloved church. The news of Kofi's arrest had shattered their trust. The man they had loved and respected had been accused of something terrible, and many couldn't bear the thought of defending him. In the aftermath, the elders took swift control. Elder Patrick was quick to step into the void, positioning himself as the voice of authority in the absence of Kofi. He gave speeches, reassuring the congregation that the church was still strong, still a beacon of light in the community. But his words rang hollow. Everyone knew something had changed. The faithful followers of Kofi's ministry were now left to grapple with their own emotions. Doubt, confusion, and fear. One afternoon, Sarah, a longtime member of the congregation, sat at home, her mind racing. She had followed Pastor Kofi from the beginning, had supported his efforts to bring transparency and accountability to the church. He had always treated her with kindness, always welcomed her with open arms. The thought of him being a predator was incomprehensible. But the news stories, the police reports, the constant barrage of accusations, it was hard to deny what was happening. Her phone rang. It was David, another member of the congregation who had stood by Pastor Kofi through thick and thin. "Sarah," David said, his voice filled with anger and confusion, "what do we do now? They've arrested him. They're telling us he's guilty. But I know him. I know he didn't do this. This whole thing feels off. It feels wrong." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't know what to think anymore, David. The elders are saying it's true. They've made it sound so real. But you're right. Something doesn't sit right with me either." They both sat in silence for a few moments, each of them struggling with the same truth. They both knew Kofi wasn't capable of what he had been accused of. But there was no proof, no evidence to counter the mountain of lies that the elders had carefully constructed. "Maybe we can't do anything right now," David finally said, his voice breaking. "But we can't let them take the church like this. We have to stand up for him. We have to find the truth." In his cell at the police station, Kofi sat with his head in his hands, trying to process everything that had happened. The walls of the small, cold room seemed to close in on him. He could barely breathe, and the weight of his failure, the failure to protect his own ministry, to safeguard his people, pressed down on him like an anvil. But in the midst of the pain, something stirred inside him. The same voice that had guided him to this point, that had called him to serve, whispered in his ear, "You are not done yet." Kofi's heart skipped a beat. He was not done yet. He had been betrayed, but that didn't mean his story was over. There was still a chance to fight, to clear his name. He stood up, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. The road ahead would be long, and the battle would be difficult. But he wasn't going to let the lies of a few corrupt men destroy everything he had worked for. He had to fight for the truth, for himself, for his congregation, and for the God who had called him to this purpose. The fight for justice had just begun. Thank you for watching. Please stick to this channel. We have beautiful videos coming your way.